Hi students, what we're going to be focusing on today is Mao's economic policies. This forms part of the syllabus which is focused on the aims and impacts of domestic policies. And it relates to Mao's consolidation and maintenance of his rule as an authoritarian leader and is vital for understanding this. So you can use economic policies for a variety of questions that relate to his consolidation and his maintenance. This is a good summary to come back to in your revision. And the key things that you need to take away from this slide is the aims. The two key aims is to produce a surplus of food that could be sold abroad to raise money for expansion of Chinese industry, and this idea of creating a modern industrial economy that would be powerful enough to compete with the West. These two key aims are tied in the variety of the economic policies that we're going to look at today. And you can see the table here offers you a bit of a summary of the chronology of the economic policies, and some key trends that you need to identify as part of this is in relation to ownership of the land, either by private or by the state, and the increase in industry. Beginning in 1950, Mao was just focused on land reform. As we move into the Great Leap Forward in 1958, 1960, the focus on industry becomes more and more prevalent as we shift away from an agricultural state into transforming China into a modern industrial one. The first five-year plan, which begins in 1952, is heavily inspired by the Soviet influence. You can see in the speech made by Stalin on the left in 1931, the whole idea of advancing in competition with other nations is vital to Stalin. It's very similar to that of Mao. Okay, we looked at his aims just before. It's to compete with the West. Stalin is making the same exact claims and the same exact aim in his first five-year plan in 1931. Steel production during the first five-year plan was a symbol of progress. And Mao, very similar to Stalin, believed that steel was vital. Okay? And it was not only vital for the production, but steel as a symbol was used heavily throughout propaganda as well. The aim of the first five-year plan was to develop state-directed growth of heavy industry. And this came as a result of, as well, with the involvement of the USSR as this first five-year plan. You can see that the Sino-Soviet Treaty, which was signed in 1950, really highlights to develop and consolidate economic and cultural ties between China and the Soviet Union. China utilized the Soviet model as Mao believed that China could not survive without USSR's economic assistance. And this was true because China was, remember, isolated from capitalist nations, so they couldn't benefit from trade with major world powers such as Britain or America. The CCP during 1952 also benefited from the GMD's NRC, which had taken control of industrial investment policy, and the 200 managers had remained in China after 1949, and when the GMD fled to Taiwan. And rural and to urban migration in 49 to 57 also benefited the CCP during the first five-year plan, as China moved from an urban population of 57 million to 110 million. So Mao is riding the coattails of the developments that had already happened within the GMD, as well as using the involvement of the USSR as a real assistance, as well as natural transition of people from rural areas to urban areas. These are the impacts of the first five-year plans. And as it notes there, these statistics are based on CCP officials and therefore prone to overinflation and exaggeration, which is going to become a core theme when we look at the economic policies and how they're recorded and marketed to the people. Some key things to take note of is the targets were in steel, coal, and petrochemicals, and it wasn't just in agriculture and infrastructure and in industry that these developments took place, but also in infrastructure as well. Road and rail networks, bridges across the Yangtze River at Nanjing were also vital. Water conservation was also a part of the first five-year plans. The first 5-year plan was vital in fueling China's involvement in the Korean War as China tries to take on a war footing in the economy. Increasing state control over the economy by pressuring private firms to sell to the state or become joint public enterprises was a core part, and also helped for Mao's extension of control over China as he looked to try to extend his control over the working class in a real clear way by taking control of farms, by taking control of industry, and getting rid of anything which might be considered capitalist ways of thinking with private ownership. 9% of economic growth between 1953 to 1957 during the first 5-year plan compared very favorably to the USSR during 1930, who had become a yardstick. Okay, China consistently measured themselves against the USSR because it made sense to do so. The Soviet model called for capital intensive development of heavy industry, with the capital to be generated from the agricultural sector of the economy. So the agricultural sector functioned as the engine for industrial development. The state would purchase grain from farmers at low prices and sell it both at home and on the export market at high prices. So we can see how the state benefits from the agricultural surpluses that they produce. In practice, agricultural production did not increase fast enough to generate the amount of capital required to build China's industry according to the plan. Mao decided that the answer was not to reorganize Chinese agriculture by pushing through a program of cooperatization or collectivization, as it's called in the Soviet Union, that would bring China's small farmers, their small plots of land, and their limited draft animals, tools, and machinery together into larger, presumably more efficient cooperatives. And that's a real key theme drawn from the Soviet Union. The farmers put up resistance, mostly in form of passive resistance, lack of cooperation, and tendency to eat animals that were scheduled for cooperatization. Many of the Communist Party leaders wanted to proceed slowly with cooperatization, but Mao had his own view and developments of the countryside, which he expressed very clearly here in 1955. He talks about the difficulties that the peasants are facing, and he speaks about it really clearly. Mao tends to speak for the peasants and says that this is coming from within them. Okay, for all these reasons, there's an active desire among most peasants to take the socialist road. So he talks about the drive towards cooperativization in agriculture is not coming from me. It's not coming from the top down. He says that in his speeches that it's coming from the bottom. It's coming from the peasants, and then this is a way of averting catastrophes. This is a way of sharing resources, of sharing expertise. This is a way of making our uncultivated land, making more efficient and effective use of it. But collective and communal farming is not what the people want. There is much sort of anger and sort of not direct opposition, but definitely unhappiness within the peasants about the process of cooperativization. So agricultural reform began transforming the countryside. Okay, this is built on the anti-landlord campaign that was looked at from 1950, in which 1 million landlords were killed and the land was redistributed. The creation of these collectives, so areas where people farm communally as opposed to individual subsistence farm, did make agriculture more efficient. And by 1955, 2/3 of all peasants, okay, roughly about 60%, had joined cooperative farmings. Collectivization was imposed and the wishes of the peasants were pretty much completely ignored. Despite being a peasant himself, Mao held them in fairly low regard as he questioned their revolutionary spirit in 1959, as he said that they were not giving enough of the products of agriculture to the people working in the industry. And this is during the midst of famine. He talks about here the steps, and you can see in a speech made by 1955 by Mao, it talks about the steps in this agricultural reform. The first one is this idea of mutual and volunteered collectivization. Then it moves on, okay, to the actual organization into cooperatives. The next step will be to put these cooperatives under much larger communal farms, and which would be under direct state control. The first 5-year plan is also accompanied by obviously a huge propaganda push. You can see on the right has the good points of collectivization, trying to really highlight to the farmers. You can see at the very top, it has the individual farms, okay, each being farmed by one single farmer. And you can see the amount of land that is left uncultivated with collectivization. As you can see on the right, we have many hands making light work, and we're able to cultivate a whole variety of land. You can see the sense that of this communal spirit, of everyone coming together, the enthusiasm of the peasants, okay, was really trying to highlight this. This could be a positive step forward in terms of the social outcomes as well. Despite the success of the collective farming, there was still not enough food for this new industrial workforce which had transferred into urban areas. Mao blamed the peasants really harshly. He said in 1953, educate peasants to eat less and have more thin gruel, which is like a thin porridge. The state should try its hardest to prevent peasants from eating too much. He believed that the peasants were gluttons. So this is a real sense that we see of Mao's real lack of empathy for the peasant situation. The creation of 750,000 collectives during 56 to 58 was successful to a limited extent. Still, we didn't have enough food. Then Mao progresses to the next phase of agricultural reform, which is collectivization. Fairbank here kind of summates the leap from the first and second 5-year plans. It says here that in 1957 that Mao had realized that the Stalinist models of industrial growth weren't suited to Chinese conditions. Very similar to ideas that he begins to develop in Yan'an in the 1930s regarding how communism and how Marxist ideas are very different in that of USSR to that in China, with the idea of the peasant should be the proletariat and we can actually have a peasant revolution. From 52 to 57, as I said before, the rural population had increased about 9%, while the city population had increased by 30%. The results were expected from the first 5-year plan, but to continue going would to invite disaster, as there wouldn't be enough food for the people in industry in the urban centers because of the sheer amount of people that were transferring into these urban areas. So begins the second 5-year plan, which gets entitled the Great Leap Forward. Mao referred to it as a leap because he thought it was going to be the grand step for the future of China. This transformation and leap from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial one that was competitive on the world stage. His aim was to try to industrialize the PRC in the shortest possible time in order to compete with the West. And you can see in Mao's speech at Congress of Communist Parties, which takes place in the USSR in 1957, and where he announces the Great Leap Forward, he took great pride in this, in going away from a Soviet model. So although he liked that idea of the peasants and of that, he needed to focus on the idea of industry. So he says the imperialists are like the sun at 5 o'clock. China, on the other hand, is that the sun is like the sun at 6 o'clock in the morning. We are the rising sun, and is because of this powerful and strong collective spirit within the people. And he says, this has become sort of characteristics of the Great Leap Forward. It doesn't matter if we don't have the technical skills or the resources or the economic management. What matters is people's hearts and minds and having this collective spirit. What he tried to do is aim high with his targets of getting a group of people, a mass mobilization of China to compete with the West. And that's really clear in the propaganda poster there. As the East leaps forward, as it is like the rising sun, and their power is setting. This creates fear, or what Mao thought, in the West. Mao's announcement of the Great Leap Forward in Moscow really is demonstrative of the admiration for what they had achieved and during the first 5-year plan, and his own determination to match Soviet economic achievement without slavishly following their method. So Mao said that no longer we would require to follow the Soviet model, but we would make it self-reliant, our major policies. This is the idea of we need to make sure that our economic policies suit China. Manpower was everything. The driver of economic advancement was the will of the people. Mao became as a result of this, the emperor of the blue ants, based on the uniforms that all of the workers used in the industry and in agriculture. Similar to the first 5-year plan, a wave of propaganda also accompanied, as you can see on the left here. The poster reads, "Transform the high river and temper yourself." You can see the people are working in the back there. The targets and quotas were not based on any sort of statistical economic analysis. They were changed frequently, they were inflated by local officials to impress Mao. And this is really evident in a financial minister in 1958 saying, "At the present, the authorities are compiling targets for the second 5-year plan, but have not been able to catch up with the swift changes in practical conditions that require upward revision of the targets almost every day." So there's really very, very poor economic mismanagement, which leads to some really key failures in the Great Leap Forward and not actually attaining any of its goals. It talks about here the process of the collectivization. Agriculture was the driver of industry. You can see allocations of manpower during the harvesting were not so well arranged in many places, yet bigger crops of grain were harvested than in previous years. So it talks about, we've got all this propaganda coming in the papers and the news about the successes of collectivization, and this is spread throughout the people. A key element of the Great Leap Forward was the creation of backyard furnaces. I'm sure you've seen images of these furnaces, these primitive smelting devices that were set up in people's backyards. This was really clear of Mao's vision for China, that everyone could participate, that hearts and minds and the will of the people of being this collective, communal-based, at home, everyone having a go, everyone getting involved was more important than any sort of technical skills. This is recorded, and the backyard furnaces was recorded by Roderick Farquhar, the British writer who lived in Beijing during his time. So people carried baskets of ore, people stoked, people goaded buffalo carts, people tipped cauldrons of white hot metal, people stood on rickety ladders and peered into the furnace, and people wheeled barrows of crude steel. This is really poorly managed and not well organized system of producing steel. This followed Mao's principles of this idea of learn by doing, which was not effective in producing high quality steel. The steel that they produced was smelted from pots and pans and bicycles, and what they did is all they produced was unused blobs, and these were collected by officials very enthusiastically and then proceeded to be dumped, covered, and not used for any sort of actual goods. These two propaganda posters really highlight the idea of this war economy. So on the right, we have put organizations on a military footing, put actions on a war footing, put life on a collective footing. Again, all of China is involved in the Great Leap Forward. And this really gives us a sense of the creation of these state-owned enterprises, as the war economy meant that the Chinese government needed to take control of these private firms, and an industry all needed to come under their control. On the left, it says mobilize the whole population to make sure that steel is doubled. This is again the focus on steel production as one of the key targets and key quotas of the Great Leap Forward. So state-owned enterprises during the Great Leap Forward were one of the most significant changes. In the first 5-year plans, we had seen a move towards joint ventures and allowing some sense of private industry to continue. Under the Great Leap Forward, this ended. Industry was under the total control of the government. Existing private firms could no longer operate and instead came under state control. Successes of this was obviously Mao's extension of control. It provided workers as well with an iron rice bowl. And what I mean by that is guaranteed job wage no matter what happened. Okay, no matter what happened, you were always fed. You were always going to have food on the table. Workers received accommodation, medical, and educational benefits. On an economic standpoint, though, it was inefficient. These state subsidies that were provided and guaranteed wages destroyed motivation, destroyed incentive for managers to work hard. As a result, they didn't produce any surpluses. They didn't produce as much as they could have, because they didn't provide any real incentive for people to do so. This is the industrial output from 1957 and 1964 from the Great Leap Forward. Some key trends that you should really try to take out of it is the successes up until 1960. You can see that coal, steel, oil, chemical fertilizers, and cotton cloth all increase. This is really to highlight the successes of the Great Leap Forward up until about 1959, 1960. The most impressive improvement was in the production of coal, which in the first year increased by 43%. So even though we look at the Great Leap Forward as more of a sort of a failure, they did increase just by the sense of focusing on these targets and these quotas. Only oil production was maintained from 57 to 64 during the Great Famine, which comes in 1959 and 58. Some of the reasons for this drop was a real lack of technical skills, as I spoke about during the backyard furnaces. They didn't produce quality steel. Managerial know-how, economic analysis, the quotas were mismanaged. They were not accurate of what could be produced for this period of time. The efficiency in factories and plants, as I said, the removal of any sense of capitalist thinking regarding providing rewards or bonuses for people who had performed well were gone. Okay, everyone got a state guaranteed wage, no matter how hard they worked or how hard they didn't work, and a real adequate transport system to fuel this growing economy. So overall, the output of industrial producers actually fell. It didn't increase, as you can see here with the production of manufactured goods. You can see in 59 is an index. It actually dropped by 30 to 1962. It also resulted in lots of negative social aspects we'll speak about in a moment with the famine. And although it was an improvement from the first five-year plan, and it did expand state control, which is really important for Mao in terms of consolidating and maintaining his power, it wasn't sound economically. From an agricultural point of view, you can see that up until 1958, Great Leap Forward does increase the grain production. This is a result of the amalgamation of 750 communes to 26,000 collectives. The collectives were on average about 120,000 households, okay, each making up about 5 members. So you can see the sheer number of people who were involved in the Great Leap Forward and who took part in agriculture during this time. This is Mao's focus, mass mobilization. We can be competitive with the world if everyone gets involved. Between 56 and 58, it served to bring the whole agricultural system under state control. The sale and distribution of grain was completely run by the state. They set the prices, they set how much was to be sold, how much was to be given to the peasants. Private farming completely vanished. It ended, unlike during the first five-year plan, which was allowed to continue on the side. And the peasants needed even internal passports to pass from one commune to another. So this is, you can see, the extension of Mao's control over the people. The trends you can see increase in grain production up until 1958, as I spoke about. Grain and meat both positively correlated to one another. And we do see slight recovery in 1962 as the famine starts to ease. The table represents China overall. It's important to note. However, the effects of famine were more prominent in central and eastern China than it was in other places. You can see here about the propaganda that is being spilled out into the media in 1959. The idea of water conservation projects. Everything has been set up for the success, but it's not the case when we look at what's happening in China in this period of time. The Great Leap Forward and the agricultural system that accompanied that was built on a USSR scientist called Lysenko. He had made discoveries, apparently, which would revolutionize farming. However, these were not successful. As I spoke about, it led to famine in 1958 to 1962. This was because of this removal of incentives, as we spoke about in industry, with the ending of private farming. There was no encouragement to produce food over their own immediate needs. So we have this kind of return to subsistence-based farming. The Lysenkoism became the official policy in 1958, and it forced farmers to follow what might be called an agricultural constitution and 8 key headings. They had to use new breeds and seeds, plant closely, plow deeply, increase fertilization, use new farm tools, improve field management, control pests, and increase irrigation. Taken individually, these agricultural policies would have potentially been effective. Together, they form a key recipe in resulting in the death of lots of crops. In addition to that, we also have the encouragement for people to kill as many sparrows as possible. What they were encouraged to do was go outside, make as much noise at designated hours to stop sparrows from landing. They therefore would drop dead from the sky in sheer exhaustion, which in turn infected the rest of the chain of system. Insects and small creatures gorged on crops without any natural competitors. As a result of the Great Leap Forward, as a direct result, the famine affected almost 50 million people between 1958 to 1962. You can see the sheer number of people who die during the famine. The most probably damning statistic there is in Tibet, where a quarter of the total population were died because of famine. During this time, peasants sold children for food, women prostituted themselves, peasants offered themselves as slaves for food, and we have some reports of cannibalism also occurring in some provinces. The death of 1 million people in Tibet during the Great Famine is seen as an act of genocide because of Mao's direct control in making this disaster. Despite sufficient farming needs prior to the takeover by China in 1950, communal farming was imposed. They were forbidden to grow barley, which was one of their key crops, and they were instructed to sow wheat and maize instead. Neither of these crops were suited to the soil, but the Tibetans couldn't do anything without any sort of army or resistance movement. The Tibetan campers, the yak farmers, were forbidden to roam pasture lands with their yak herds, and instead they had to become their nomadic way of life simply was outlawed. For Mao, the Great Leap Forward was a test of China's manpower. He really disregards economic principles, and he believed that manpower and faith in China and the people would be enough. This wasted rather than exploited China's natural resources. You can see here this idea of everyone coming together, beating the drum, and we will continue the Great Leap Forward into 1960. This is during the midst of famine and people dying. The communal efforts were enthusiastically received by Chinese and did impress foreigners, although it did little to really meet the needs and to transform China into a modern industrial economy. This was due to the following points that you can see on the slide. The quality of finished products fell short of the needs. That's really evident in the backyard furnaces. Political interference and this idea of using it as a political tool to extend and consolidate Mao's control made it impossible for the Great Leap Forward to be correctly economically managed. You can see this as well in the statistics and how what is recorded does actually not meet what actually was going on in the fields. Officials issued demands and threat but provided few detailed instructions. The state-owned enterprises never functioned based on integrated national plan but were left to kind of local initiative. It was difficult to achieve effective organization and quality control, and most importantly, in 1960 as well, the USSR, as a result of changing foreign policy, withdraws technical assistance, which led to the closure of half of the 300 industrial plants they had sponsored. These failures are reflected on Mao's ability to lead. And in 1959, as you know, he actually stepped down as head of state, and although he retained as chairman, he put a whole new board of people as the new leaders of China. And he himself kind of understood that he is not an economic planner. He says, I understand social sciences, but not natural sciences. So what you need to do when you have a think about in terms of when you come back to class is to what extent did the Great Leap Forward allow Mao to consolidate his power? So you might think about, even though of the economic failures and the way this reflected poorly on Mao's leadership, did it help him in consolidating his control? You should now be able to go ahead and answer at least half of this question. that social and economic policies in authoritarian states do not always achieve their aims. Discuss with reference to two or one authoritarian state. Some things that you might have to consider in terms of an economic view is industrialization, agriculture, transport, taxation, trade, and labor. And what you are going to do is have a look at some of the social policies and how maybe they didn't achieve their aims. I look forward to discussing this with you in our next class.